I was always the quiet one in the family, the one who never asked for too much and rarely got noticed when I did. My name is Anna, and at 42 years old, I sometimes wonder if my entire life has been shaped by the fact that I was born the middle child. My older brother, Daniel, was the golden boy. He was the one who could do no wrong, the one whose report cards were framed and whose trophies lined the shelf in our living room. My youngest sister, Lily, was the baby, fragile and sweet, showered with endless affection. And then there was me, somewhere in between, neither celebrated nor coddled, always the one expected to manage on her own. Growing up, I learned to live with it. Birthdays were often an afterthought. I remember turning 10 and blowing out candles on a cake Daniel had chosen, because our parents said they didn't have time to get another. My achievements, though small, were mine. I got into the debate team, won a regional essay contest, but they barely warranted a nod at the dinner table. Meanwhile, Daniel's soccer victories meant expensive dinners out, and Lily's artwork was taped proudly to the refrigerator while my writing sat forgotten in a drawer. Over the years, this pattern became so normal that I convinced myself it didn't bother me. I went off to college on a scholarship, worked part-time jobs to pay what the scholarship didn't cover, and slowly built a life for myself. I didn't rely on my parents for support, because I knew it wouldn't come. They paid for Daniel's tuition and even his first apartment, while Lily was given money for her art classes and travel. For me, there was silence. My worth was always measured against theirs, and somehow, I was always found lacking. Even so, I visited when I could. I came home for holidays, brought thoughtful gifts, tried to maintain some sort of connection, even when it wasn't reciprocated in the same way. A part of me, I think, always hoped that one day they would see me, not just as the middle child, not just as someone who filled the gaps, but as their daughter who had worked so hard to matter. That day never seemed to come. Until the phone call. It was a Sunday morning when my father's voice came through the line, clipped and businesslike, as though he were arranging a meeting with a colleague rather than speaking to his own child. "Anna," he said, "we need you at the house this Saturday. Your mother and I have some things to discuss. It concerns the family estate." I froze, gripping the phone tighter. Estate. Will. These were words I had only heard whispered between relatives at funerals, never spoken directly to me. My parents weren't frail, but they were aging, and suddenly the reality of what that meant pressed down on me. Still, what surprised me most wasn't the topic, but the fact that I was included at all. For days leading up to Saturday, unease settled into my stomach. I replayed old memories, wondering if this would finally be the moment I was acknowledged, or if, once again, I would be overlooked in favor of Daniel and Lily. I could almost hear the echo of my father's voice, curt and dismissive, telling me to accept whatever decision had already been made. When I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home that weekend, the air felt heavy with expectation. Daniel's car was already there, sleek and expensive, parked right at the front as if announcing his importance. Lily's smaller, brightly colored car was tucked neatly beside it, a reflection of her cheerful, carefree personality. I parked a little further down, as I always did, not wanting to take up too much space. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. My mother fussed over Daniel, bringing him a drink, while Lily perched on the sofa, chatting animatedly. Neither of them seemed particularly nervous. It was as though they already knew what was about to be said. My father stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, waiting for me to take my place like an extra in a play that had been rehearsed without me. That's when he cleared his throat, his voice low but carrying enough weight to silence the room. "We've gathered everyone here to go over the matter of our inheritance," he began. My pulse quickened. For a brief moment, a flicker of hope sparked in me. The possibility that after years of being invisible, I might finally be seen. But something in his eyes told me otherwise. The living room had always felt too big when I was a child, with its high ceilings and heavy curtains that shut out most of the sunlight. That day it felt suffocating, every piece of furniture positioned like part of a stage, every face in the room cast in a role they knew well. Daniel sat confidently in the armchair closest to my father, his wife perched beside him, her manicured nails glinting as she smoothed the hem of her designer dress. Lily had curled up on the couch with her fiancé, their hands intertwined, whispering back and forth as though this were a social gathering instead of a reckoning. I chose a quieter spot on the far end of the sofa, deliberately away from the center of attention. A cup of tea had been placed in front of Daniel and another for Lily, yet none was offered to me. My mother walked past me twice without even glancing down. The sting was familiar, almost comforting in its consistency, but today it felt heavier. The lawyer sat at the coffee table, a large leather briefcase resting by his polished shoes, his eyes moving carefully from one face to the next as though cataloging details for later. My father cleared his throat. The sound was sharp, commanding, pulling everyone's attention instantly. "We've called you all here," he began, "to settle the matter of our estate." His voice was even, practiced, as though he had rehearsed it many times. My heart thudded, but I kept my face still, afraid to betray how much his words mattered. He looked at Daniel first, then at Lily, his gaze warm and approving. When his eyes finally fell on me, they lingered only a moment before sliding away, dismissive. "We've had the will drawn up," he continued. "It reflects our wishes regarding the division of property, finances, and family assets." Daniel leaned back in his chair, smugness written all over him, as if he already knew his slice would be the largest. Lily smiled, her fingers tightening around her fiancé's hand. The lawyer opened his briefcase but didn't speak, waiting for my father's signal. Then my mother spoke, her voice softer but cutting in a way that pierced me more deeply. "Anna," she said, finally acknowledging me, "you should know before this is read, you're not mentioned." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. The room seemed to tilt, my breath catching in my throat. "What?" I managed, my voice barely a whisper. My father didn't flinch. "You were forgotten," he said simply, as though it were nothing more than a clerical error. "The will covers Daniel and Lily. You were left out." The words dropped like stones into the silence. My chest tightened. Forgotten. That single word echoed through me, dragging behind it years of being overlooked, dismissed, erased. My palms grew damp, and I pressed them against my knees to steady myself. Daniel smirked, exchanging a glance with his wife, who raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Well, of course." Lily's lips curved into a small, almost apologetic smile, but her eyes held no real sympathy. It was the same look she had given me as children when she was given something I wasn't, a toy, a trip, affection, a mix of pity and superiority. I wanted to speak, to argue, to demand how a parent could simply forget their child when dividing the sum of their life. But the weight in my throat pressed harder, and the words refused to form. I could only sit there, staring at them, feeling the familiar band of invisibility wrap itself around me once more. The lawyer shifted slightly, his face impassive but his eyes alert. He didn't interrupt, but I noticed the faint tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers hovered over the papers as though holding back a truth not yet revealed. He looked at me once, briefly, with something almost like sympathy, before returning to his professional mask. My father clasped his hands behind his back, as if the matter was settled. "That's all there is to it," he said firmly. "The estate is divided equally between Daniel and Lily. You'll understand, Anna, that it makes sense. You've made your own way, after all." The casual cruelty in his words made my stomach churn. My own way, as though being forced to survive alone, without their support, had been a choice. As though their neglect was proof that I didn't deserve a place in their legacy. No one else spoke. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. My siblings basked in their victory. My parents stood tall in their decision. And the lawyer waited with that unreadable patience that suggested he knew something no one else did. And me, I sat frozen, devastated, the word forgotten ringing louder than anything else in the room. I sat in that suffocating room, their words echoing around me like a cruel refrain. Forgotten. The smirk on Daniel's face, Lily's delicate, pitying smile. It all pulled me backward into years I had tried to bury, years when this pattern was carved into me so deeply I stopped questioning it. I remembered a family vacation when I was 9. My parents had taken Daniel and Lily to Florida to visit Disney World. They told me there wasn't enough room in the car, that I was old enough to stay with Aunt Clara for the week. I had waved them off with a brave smile, pretending it didn't matter, then cried myself to sleep on Clara's scratchy couch. When they returned, the house was filled with photographs, souvenirs, and endless stories. Daniel had ridden Space Mountain 3 times. Lily had hugged Cinderella. My parents' faces glowed as they replayed every detail at the dinner table. I sat quietly with my untouched plate, invisible. It was always like that. Daniel was sent to the best private school, his tuition and soccer club fees paid without hesitation. I went to the underfunded public school down the road, where I learned to stretch secondhand textbooks and save lunch money for weeks just to afford supplies. When Daniel struggled in math, my parents hired him a tutor. When I struggled in chemistry, my father told me I wasn't cut out for science and should stop wasting time. Lily, the youngest, floated through life on a cushion of indulgence. She painted a picture of a cat once, barely recognizable, but my mother clapped as though she had witnessed a masterpiece. They framed it and hung it in the hallway. I remember showing them the essay I had written, the one that won first place in a regional contest. My teacher had said it was the best she'd read in years. My father glanced at it for 2 seconds before sliding it aside. "Essays don't get you anywhere in life," he muttered. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it away, swallowing the sting. The worst part wasn't the neglect itself, but the constant message that it was justified. Daniel was the star athlete, destined for greatness. Lily was delicate, creative, the precious baby of the family. And me? I was independent. That was the word they liked to use, as though it were praise. And it doesn't need much, my mother often said at gatherings. She's strong on her own. The relatives would nod approvingly, not realizing what it meant, that I was left out, unsupported, unrecognized. There were birthdays with store-bought cakes that weren't even my favorite flavor, rushed and half-forgotten between Daniel's tournaments and Lily's recitals. There were Christmas mornings when my siblings unwrapped expensive gifts while I got practical items, socks, a school bag, things that felt more like chores than celebrations. Each slight, each dismissal, led itself into me until I began to expect nothing at all. Yet even in the midst of it, I held on to something they couldn't touch. Resilience. I studied harder, worked longer, fought for every scrap of recognition outside those walls. I got myself into college, won scholarships, held down jobs to survive. While Daniel partied on his parents' dime and Lily drifted from one half-hearted project to another, I learned how to build a life brick by brick, even if no one applauded. Still, the longing never left. No matter how strong I became, part of me still ached for their approval. I wanted them to look at me and see not the forgotten middle child, but a daughter worthy of pride. That small flicker of hope had carried me all the way into adulthood, a stubborn ember I couldn't extinguish. And now here I was, sitting in their living room, 42 years old, hearing them say the very thing I had feared all along. I didn't matter enough to be remembered. It was as though every forgotten birthday, every ignored achievement, every empty chair on family trips had led to this moment. I felt sadness rising like a tide. Grief for the child who had been overlooked, the teenager who had been dismissed, the woman who had built her life from scraps. But beneath the sadness, anger coiled tight, a fire I had never allowed myself to fully feel. How dare they? How dare they erase me so casually, as if decades of my life meant nothing? And yet, buried under all of it, there was something steadier. That same resilience I had carried since childhood whispered that this wasn't the end of my story. They could try to erase me, but I had already survived without them. If they thought they could simply forget me, they were about to discover just how unforgettable I had become. The silence in the room was thick, my parents' words still hanging in the air like a final judgment. Forgotten, I stayed down at my hands, willing them not to tremble. Daniel leaned back with his practiced smirk. Lily offered her faint, patronizing smile, and for a moment it seemed the meeting was over, that my erasure was complete. Then the lawyer cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but it cut through the smugness like a blade. He adjusted his glasses, set a neat stack of papers on the table, and looked at my father with calm precision. "With respect, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, he said, we should proceed with the official reading of the will. My father's jaw tightened. That won't be necessary, he replied briskly. We've explained the arrangement. Daniel and Lily are the beneficiaries. Anna understands. He spoke my name as though it were an afterthought, an inconvenience. The lawyer didn't move. His voice remained even, but there was steel beneath it. I'm afraid it is necessary. By law, the will must be read in its entirety in the presence of all heirs. My mother shifted uneasily in her seat, her eyes darting toward my father. Perhaps we can postpone this, she suggested lightly, though her voice betrayed strain. There are details we might prefer to discuss privately. Daniel frowned, sensing something he hadn't expected. What details? He asked. The lawyer opened the folder and began to read. His voice was steady, each word deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation. He outlined the division of property, the family home, the investments, the accounts. Daniel's smirk returned as his name was mentioned again and again. Lily's smile widened each time her share was confirmed. And then, and finally, the lawyer said, his eyes lifting from the page to settle directly on me, there's the matter of the Whitmore Trust. The room froze. My father's face blanched. That's not relevant, he snapped, his voice sharper now. The lawyer continued as if he hadn't spoken. The Whitmore Trust was established 23 years ago by your late grandparents. It was created in Anna Whitmore's name, with the stipulation that it remain undisclosed until the passing of both Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, at which point it would come fully into effect. The air seemed to leave the room. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her skin drained of color. Daniel sat forward, no longer smug but pale and rigid. Lily blinked rapidly, confusion flickering across her features. I could only stay. My name, spoken not as an afterthought, not as a dismissal, but as the center of something monumental. A trust. From my grandparents. My chest tightened, a swirl of disbelief and vindication tangling inside me. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued. The trust includes ownership of the Whitmore Lake property, along with its adjoining acres, valued at over $7 million. In addition, the trust stipulates an investment portfolio set aside for Ms. Whitmore to be transferred in full upon the reading of this will. The room erupted. Daniel shot to his feet. What? That's impossible. That land was promised to me. Dad, you said. My father's voice shook with rage. It was supposed to be changed. That clause was never meant to stand. He stopped himself, breathing hard, his face red. The lawyer's expression remained unflinching. I'm afraid it cannot be altered. Your parents, Mr. Whitmore, signed the trust as a legally binding document. Their signatures, along with those of 2 witnesses, make it irrevocable. Lily's fiancé muttered something under his breath, his hand slipping from hers as he stared wide-eyed at me, then at the lawyer. My mother finally spoke, her voice breaking. They did this without telling us. Why would they? She trailed off, shaking her head. I sat frozen, heart pounding in my chest. A memory stirred, my grandmother's hand resting gently on mine when I was 15, the way she had looked at me with quiet affection, so unlike my parents. One day, Anna, she had whispered, you'll understand how much you matter. At the time, I thought she meant nothing more than comfort. Now it all came flooding back. My father slammed his fist on the table. This is absurd. She doesn't deserve that property. She's done nothing for this family. His words cracked with desperation, and for the first time, I realized the fear beneath his anger. The lawyer's gaze sharpened. On the contrary, the trust was established precisely because Anna had been overlooked. Your parents, her grandparents, wanted to ensure she was protected. They foresaw the imbalance, and they acted accordingly. A strangled sound escaped my mother, half sob, half gasp. She sank back into her chair, her shoulders trembling. Daniel paced furiously, running a hand through his hair, while Lily sat stunned, her face pale, lips parted in disbelief. I felt as though the ground beneath me had shifted. All those years of being forgotten, dismissed, erased, and yet, silently, quietly, my grandparents had carved a place for me. They had seen me. The lawyer closed the folder with finality. The Whitmore Trust transfers immediately. Anna is now the sole beneficiary of the lake property and its assets. Nothing can contest this. The weight of the words crashed over the room. My father's face crumpled, his fury dissolving into something I had never seen in him before: defeat. My mother leaned heavily against him, whispering his name like a prayer. Daniel cursed under his breath, his composure shattered, while Lily sat rigid, her eyes darting between me and the lawyer, unable to process the shift. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the lawyer's calm presence anchored the chaos. And in the middle of it all, I sat still, the word that had haunted me all my life echoing differently now. Not forgotten, never forgotten. The silence after the lawyer's final words stretched out like a chasm. For a moment, no one seemed to breathe. Then, as if on cue, the room erupted into chaos. Daniel was the first to break, his voice sharp, almost feral. "You told me," he shouted at my father, his fingers stabbing the air. "You told me the lake house was mine. You promised it years ago. I've been counting on it, planning for it." His wife tugged at his sleeve, but he shook her off, his face red with fury. My father, usually composed and controlled, looked suddenly small in his chair. "It was supposed to be," he muttered, his voice cracking. "We never thought. We didn't know your grandparents." "You didn't know because you didn't bother to check," Daniel snapped. "You sat there bragging about how you'd secured our future while secretly letting her," he flung his hand toward me, "walk away with everything that matters." I flinched at the venom in his tone, but the blow didn't land the way it once would have. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one shrinking in this room. Lily's reaction was quieter, but no less cutting. Her face had gone pale, and her voice trembled as she looked at our parents. "You told me I'd never have to worry. You said you'd make sure Daniel and I were always provided for, that Anna could take care of herself. That's what you said." Her words dripped with betrayal, as though their broken promise had wounded her more than their years of neglect had ever wounded me. My mother reached out, her voice breaking. "Lily, darling, we thought." "You thought wrong," Lily snapped, pulling away. Her fiancé shifted uncomfortably beside her, no longer holding her hand, his eyes darting between me and the lawyer with something dangerously close to calculation. I sat still, my heart hammering but my face calm. A strange mix of emotions surged through me. Vindication. Yes, the sweet relief of finally being acknowledged in some undeniable way. But laid over it was sadness, thick and heavy. This wasn't triumph. This wasn't how I wanted to be seen. I hadn't asked for revenge or retribution. All I had ever wanted was to matter, to be loved as they claimed to love Daniel and Lily. And now, as their world crumbled, I realized that recognition had come at a price too high for anyone to celebrate. The lawyer's voice broke through the storm, calm and professional. "I must remind you all," he said firmly, "the trust is irrevocable. It cannot be challenged or revised. The estate division stands as written. The lake property and associated assets now belong solely to Anna Whitmore. Any attempts to contest this will fail." Daniel turned on him, eyes blazing. "There's to be a loophole. Some clause, something." "There isn't," the lawyer replied without hesitation. "Your grandparents were explicit. They anticipated the possibility of interference, which is why they structured the trust the way they did. This is final." The room fell into another heavy silence, but this time it was fractured, unstable. I could feel the shift in the air as alliances dissolved and fault lines deepened. Daniel rounded on my father again. "You're pathetic," he spat. "All these years, you acted like you had everything under control, and now you've left us with nothing." "Nothing." My father's face flushed with humiliation. "Watch your tone," he barked, but the authority was gone from his voice. He looked toward my mother, as if seeking reinforcement, but she sat crumpled in her chair, tears streaking her face. "How could we not know?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "How could they do this behind our backs?" Her words struck me with bitter irony. "Behind your backs? I thought you've been doing things behind mine my whole life." Lily's voice cracked as she turned on them both. "You made us believe she didn't matter. You told us she'd be left out, that she didn't need what we needed. And now look at us, we're the fools. Do you realize how humiliated I am? My fiancé's family was expecting. She stopped abruptly, but the implication hung in the air. They had been counting on the inheritance too. My father's hands shook as he raked them through his thinning hair. We did what we thought was right, he muttered. No, Daniel snapped, his voice raw. You did what was easy. You ignored her, and now it's come back to destroy us. For the first time, my parents looked at each other, their carefully constructed front unraveling. My mother's eyes flashed with accusation. You always said it was handled, she hissed at my father. You swore everything was in order. And you never wanted to involve me. My father shot back, his voice rising. You let your parents meddle, and now look at the mess they've left us. Their argument escalated, their voices clashing, each blaming the other, while Daniel paced like a caged animal and Lily sat rigid, her face twisted with resentment. I watched it all unfold, strangely detached. This was the family I had yearned to be part of, the family whose approval I had craved. And now, stripped of their illusions, they were nothing but a collection of bitter, grasping people tearing each other apart. The lawyer packed his papers calmly, unaffected by the storm. He glanced at me once, offering the faintest nod, as if to say, stand tall. You've already won. I took a slow breath, my chest heavy. I hadn't come here to win. I had come hoping, foolishly, that I might finally be included. But what I had been given instead was the truth, brutal, undeniable, and final. The Whitmores, the family I had once longed for, were gone. What remained was a broken collection of people, too consumed by greed and betrayal to see the daughter who had been in front of them all along. And for the first time, I realized that maybe I didn't need them to see me anymore. The house was quieter when the storm of accusations finally burned itself out. My siblings had stormed off in separate directions, leaving only the faint echo of slammed doors. My parents sat hunched together, no longer a united front, but two broken figures bound by shame. The lawyer had left, briefcase in hand, after confirming one last time that the will was beyond question. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap. The papers that declared me heir to the trust lay on the table between us, a silent weight that seemed far heavier than ink and signatures should allow. For years, I had dreamed of being acknowledged, of someone, anyone, in this family looking at me and saying, "You matter. We see you." I thought that dream would fill me with joy, but the reality felt different. The acknowledgement hadn't come from their love or their recognition of my worth. It had come from a clause hidden in old paperwork, from grandparents who had seen the truth long before my parents ever would. And yet, it was still the truth. They hadn't forgotten me. The world hadn't erased me. Somewhere, in quiet foresight, someone had believed I deserved better. That realization brought a calm I hadn't known I was waiting for. My father finally looked at me, his face lined with exhaustion. "Anna, we didn't mean." "Yes, you did," I said softly, but firmly. "You meant every dismissal, every time you chose them over me. You made it clear, my whole life, that I was less. Tonight only proved that you never really knew me at all." My mother's eyes filled with tears. She reached out a trembling hand, but I didn't move to take it. For once, I didn't feel the pull of longing, that desperate need to close the distance between us. What I felt instead was release. "I don't need your apology," I continued. "Not anymore. What I needed was recognition, love, support, but I learned how to live without it. And now I see that I'm stronger for it." The papers on the table stayed back at me, offering wealth, property, a future secured. For years, that inheritance would have felt like justice, a way to finally balance the scales. But now, I realized it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the clarity. I stood, pushing the chair back with a quiet scrape. My parents looked up at me with wide, uncertain eyes. Daniel and Lily had slipped back into the room by then, curiosity pulling them despite their anger. They hovered in the doorway, their faces pale, waiting to see what I would say. "I'll accept the inheritance," I said at last, my voice steady. I saw their shoulders tense, Heard Lily's sharp inhale. Not because I want to take anything from you, but because it was entrusted to me. Because my grandparents wanted me to have it. That's not something I can, or should, throw away. My father flinched as if struck. Daniel's mouth opened, then snapped shut, his face twisted with rage he couldn't express. But, I added, letting the word hang in the heavy air, don't mistake this for reconciliation. This isn't about revenge, but it isn't forgiveness either. This inheritance doesn't erase the years you ignored me. It doesn't buy back the birthdays you forgot or the moments you dismissed my worth. Those scars remain, and I won't keep reopening them just to make you comfortable. Silence filled the room. For the first time, it was their turn to sit in discomfort, their turn to feel what it meant to be powerless in the face of truth. I picked up the folder of documents, tucking it under my arm. As I moved toward the door, I paused, looking back at them one last time. I spent my life thinking I was the forgotten one, I said quietly. But tonight proved something different. I wasn't forgotten. I was underestimated. And I won't ever let that happen again. I walked out into the night air, cool and sharp against my skin. The weight I carried wasn't the trust or the property. It was the certainty that I no longer needed their approval to define me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the overlooked child, the background shadow, the afterthought. I was myself, whole, strong, and free. And in that freedom, I found the inheritance I truly valued. Not money, not property, but self-respect. The kind no one could ever take away. It had been 2 years since that night. 2 years since the will was read, the truth revealed, and the walls of my family's perfect facade came crumbling down. In that time, my life had shifted into something I never could have imagined while sitting in that tense living room. The lake house had become mine, not just in name, but in spirit. I had restored it, turning the cold shell of inheritance into a warm sanctuary. The mornings were my favorite, mist rising off the water, coffee steaming in my hands, and the sound of laughter from the circle of friends who had, over time, become the family I had chosen for myself. I no longer carried the weight of longing for their approval. I had poured my energy into building a life defined not by absence, but by presence. Presence of kindness, honesty, and people who valued me for who I was. It was not always easy. Healing never is. But each day was a reminder that I hadn't been forgotten, only underestimated. As for my parents, their world had grown quieter. Daniel's bitterness drove him further into debt after a string of failed ventures. Lily's engagement dissolved within months of the will reading. Her fiancé had been more invested in the inheritance than in her. My parents, once the center of every gathering, found themselves sidelined, abandoned by the very children they had favored. I heard, through the small-town grapevine, that they live mostly in silence now, surrounded not by adoring family but by regret. I hadn't seen them since. I didn't need to. Some wounds were better left as scars, reminders of what I'd survived. One evening, standing on the dock as the sun set in blazing colors across the lake, I thought back to the words that had once shattered me. We forgot you in the will. They had tried to erase me with a sentence. But the truth had a way of surfacing, as relentless as the tide. And as the water rippled with the fading light, I smiled to myself, knowing one thing with certainty. They tried to forget me in their will. But life had already written me into something bigger.